my sons went to a Jesuit high school where I think one of the slogans or the themes was men in service of others.
Yeah.
And there was a theme of what it meant to be a man that is so diametrically opposed to the monster theme, which is that
Mm-hmm.
that men are role models, men are patient, men know how to lose with grace. The concept of sportsmanship, all of that is thrown out. So, one of
Yes.
the least manly things in the world was to be a sore loser. And yet, you talked about this in your very interesting interview with Politico in the last week, that people like Cawthorn and Hawley, who are supporting Stop the Steal, and instead of being regarded in this community as sore losers, this is an example that they are men standing up and fighting for liberty at all costs, right? So, I mean, that's the theme there. That's the new definition of what it means to be a man.
Exactly. So all of this is framed in terms of war, our current war, right? The culture wars against the left. So in this case, pro-Trump, and in all of this, the ends justify the means. So forget sportsmanship, forget being a good loser. But I do want to say all of that you just pointed out there is really important to emphasize that there are different models of masculinity out there. Historically, there are different models of Christian manhood, traditionally, right, in church history, and different models of Christian masculinity in American evangelicalism. In the 19th century, to be a Christian man was to exercise self restraint, a gentlemanly self
Yes,
restraint.
right.
That was true Christian manhood, right? And so it's really important because in this rhetoric that we hear from folks like Hawley and Cawthorn, they're presenting their iteration of masculinity as timeless, as eternal, as common sense, as given. And it is this aggressive form, but that is just one iteration. And in some ways, we might even say an aberration of masculinity or of certainly of Christian manhood when we have a historical perspective.
Well, just one last thought on this: that one of the definitions of manhood used to be that if you were a father, you would teach your son what it meant to be a man, and how being a
Mm.
man was different than being, say, a bully. That there
Yes.
was a very clear line between being the bully on the playground or the whiner on the playground and being manly. And now this conflation of manhood with being a bully is really quite extraordinary. Even leaving aside Christianity, just good sportsmanship, just being a good person. And this is, and I think I wrote this a couple of years ago, before I'd seen your book, but this is a very difficult time now to raise boys, because
Hmm.
there used to be kind of a clear view of what you wanted young men to grow up to be. And now look at the role models that they're being shown. Look at the values they're being shown. And it feels as if there's been a really tectonic shift over the last several decades. And like, okay, instead of teaching you to be sensitive, to be a good sport, let's teach you to be a monster, to be a bully, to smash back. Let's hold up the example of a young man who kills somebody, as opposed to a young man who is in service of others. I mean, this is a rather dramatic moment in our culture and in the church.
Hmm. I mean, it is a hard time to raise boys. It's a hard time to raise girls too. I'm trying to do both
Mhm.
right now, and but then the solutions that are presented, right? That they're not necessarily. Some of the solutions make the problem worse, right? Or we have this because this model of being a monster, or Holly will set up the challenges facing our boys in this modern culture, and we've got porn and we've got video games, and the truth is there are a lot of challenges to raising boys and to raising girls in terms of our social media culture, in terms of our economic situation, in terms of higher education, and there are so many challenges, but that doesn't justify this kind of reactionary model of masculinity, which arguably could end up making things much worse for individual boys, because the truth is all of these models of militant masculinity, in reality, very few men live into those ideals. And so, what was striking in my research is talking to evangelical men who grew up in these spaces, who encountered these ideals of warrior masculinity. So many of them were we just couldn't live into them, couldn't live up to them. They didn't want to go climb a mountain on the weekend. They'd rather go to an art museum. They felt like second class Christians, they told me, and they felt like not real men. And many of these men ended up walking away from evangelical churches or walking away from Christianity itself because they could not fit themselves into that narrow box. And so I think that's worth thinking about too when we think about what is masculinity, what do American boys need, to be very careful about creating some artificial boxes and then trying to force people into them.
So while we're talking, I'm thinking about this, that in Josh Hawley's critique of what's wrong with young men, and look, there are significant problems. I mean, young men are more
Mhm.
likely to be addicted to drugs, to die of drugs. Young men are more likely to be involved in violence, drop out of school. I mean, you could make a case that there is a crisis for young men, but he's talking about in particular, young men who spend time. Playing video games, and that they need to come out of that and become these warriors, these warriors and these monsters. It strikes me as that's in many ways what a lot of those young men are doing, right? I mean, that they sit in their mother's basement, to use a cliche, and they fantasize that in
Yeah,
fact they are warriors. They fantasize that they are monsters. This is exactly what they are doing when they are playing the video game. This makes them feel that they are powerful. This makes them
exactly.
feel that they can destroy things. So somehow, in many ways, he's offering kind of just a mirror image of fantasy world that has nothing to do with real manhood.
Exactly, until that fantasy gets acted out in reality, right? And I think that's this moment that we're facing right now. You mentioned the Stop the Steal movement, and somebody like Josh Hawley and Madison Cawthorn gave a speech at the Stop the Steal rally before the January 6th insurrection. And part of the context here is the fact that, this rhetoric is not new. This culture wars language, this warrior masculinity is not new. What we are facing right now is we have the variable of Trump kind of destabilizing everything, but also you have demographic changes, which mean that white Christians are no longer going to be in the majority. And so there is a new questioning of democracy in terms of getting us where we need to go, getting the nation where it needs to go. Because if you no longer have the majority, or if you're looking at no longer having the majority, maybe democracy isn't sacred. And I think that's what makes our current moment so dangerous, is that many conservatives and conservative white Christians are now rethinking democracy, things like voter suppression, the Stop the Steal. I think we have like
Hmm.
60% of white evangelicals who think the election was stolen. And of those, 39% think that violence may be necessary to save the
It's
country.
a
This is from a
stunning
very
number.
recent
I know. I
PRI
saw that.
poll.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I saw. I mean, 39%. Now let's, you know, probably admit the vast majority of those people are just blowing hot air. But you don't need a huge percentage of
No.
Americans believing in violence for things to get very dangerous. Speaking of which, talk to me a little bit about Kyle Rittenhouse as hero. Kyle
Yes.
Rittenhouse as role model. Whether you think this will have an effect, because it appears that you have right wing media from Tucker Carlson all the way up to the former guy in Mar-a-Lago, who are all in on Kyle Rittenhouse as the new model of American youth hero.
Yes, and it's not just kind of right wing media. It's within evangelicalism too. So I was just reading a newsletter from Focus on the Family that came a couple of days ago,
Oh,
maybe just
oh.
yesterday, and it included an article that is holding up Kyle Rittenhouse as this young, white, patriotic American boy
Focus on the
who
family.
Focus on the family.
Oh,
Yes,
God
yes. And
almighty.
I saw, on
Jesus
social media,
Christ.
many evangelical leaders responding to that verdict with praise God, glory to God that justice was done here. And it wasn't just, that justice was done in some technical legal capacity, arguments about self-defense. It really was celebrating that this good young man, white young man, who did what needed to be done, who fulfilled the role that government failed to do. He was the hero. He was the monster, and he channeled that appropriately. So it is open celebration in many conservative white evangelical spaces as well.
He did what Jesus would have done if he'd been in Kenosha with an AR-15.
Yeah.
I don't I'm sorry. That's just but okay, here, how many of them though would think it's a good idea for one of their teenage children to
Yeah.
take a weapon like that into a situation of urban disturbance? I mean, how much of this is just this kind of, keyboard warrior stuff?
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to think of the kind of people that I associate with focus on the family. How many of them would say, "Yeah, Ma, would you drive, Sarah, into downtown Milwaukee? Make sure she takes the AR-15 and the Glock with her.
Well,
Yes, I
right.
know she's only 17, but this is what Jesus." I mean, really? These
Well, that's not
people.
really Sarah's job, right? Right. That needs to be
Oh, I'm
Tyler or
sorry. That was my
Kevin. Yeah.
that was my big mistake. Tad. Tad.
But
Yeah.
no, you're right. For me, yes, keyboard warriors, sure, but there's this strong underlying affinity, and this is where I think we're at, because the majority of white evangelicals also were not storming the Capitol on
Right.
January 6th, right? But I was watching very closely in those circles. What was the response? The initial response was denial, following Franklin Graham's example of this is Antifa. This isn't who you think it is.
Right.
And then that was unsustainable. So then it was a lot of silence. And
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
started hearing, we don't condone violence, but,
But
and then a whole lot of justification. And I think in the moment that we find ourselves in, the critical question is, where are these moderate evangelicals, quote unquote moderate evangelicals, going to fall when push comes to shove, in terms of, an event like January 6th, in terms of Stop the Steal, in terms of the erosion of democratic norms and institutions, in terms of whatever is next, whatever event comes next? Where are these moderate
well
evangelicals going to fall?
well, what do you think?
It is still an open question for me. I'm watching things closely. I'm not optimistic right now,
You've
but
gotten
by
used
what
to
I see.
disappointment.